I had never heard of the Dark Goddess probably before about 1988. And I did a retreat in about 1987, 88 in California called the Goddess's Crone. And it was on Halloween. And we got into the cauldron and the crone energy and, you know, masks. And it was really wonderful. And then the next year, I was working with a few group of women doing ritual, two of whom are dancers in California, Arisika Razak, who does this black vulva dance. And somehow, I don't know if they knew or I knew, but somehow this word came up, and it was Dark Goddess. And I said, well, let's do a Dark Goddess retreat next year for Halloween. And they said, yeah, let's. We'll all pick one we know of. I didn't even know who the Dark Goddesses were then. So when we started discussing it, I thought, I know about Pele because I had done Hawaiian dance, so I will be Pele. And Jamie Miller, who's a Middle East dancer, chose Kali, and Arisika was Inanna, and Sidonia Cahill, who does Vision Quest in California, she chose to be Hecate. And one other woman who did masks with us chose Medusa. She made an incredible masks with snakes all around. So what we did, the five of us, is we met together and made our masks before it started. And then we did it at a place called Isis Oasis in Northern California in Geyserville. And, you know, we had about 15 other women come. And the night of Halloween, we were around the fire outside in this cauldron. And before the other women, the idea to bring them in, they were all in costume, was Inanna, who had like a half black and half white mask, was going to lead them around the grounds. So while Inanna was in the temple with them, leading them, the four of us were by the fire with a filmmaker. And she caught some of this is on film, and it's really funny. And we got totally into character. I said, tonight no one can be who they are. You have to be your goddess. And it got really funny. You know, I was burning everyone up as Pele, and Kali was running around, you know, doing crazy things. And so just to hear this dialogue, and also we were cracking up laughing. But then Inanna never came with the rest of the women. So we said, Inanna, what is she doing to the women in the temple? You know? And so we started really bad-mouthing Inanna. Well, finally she came with this circle of women. It was really awesome. It was like a spiral that, you know, she brought them to the fire. And then we took them through this ritual, and at the end asked them to eat seeds of the pomegranate. And that was their commitment to come back to the dark. You know, only take the seeds if you're willing to come back. And then we did a procession. There was a theater there. There's a theater building at Isis Oasis. So we did a procession up the stairs of the theater into the theater, at which point everyone had their drums, rattles, and instruments. And then we did a lot of music. And then each woman, when she felt moved, got up in the middle and did some kind of performance. You know, it was usually some kind of dance or movement, but sometimes it was also singing with it or poetry, as whoever she was, as her goddess. And some of them were like imaginary goddesses, spider goddesses, but all very dark. And it was was extremely wild. I mean, it was like things that, you know, when you see them at the film, no one said, please don't ever show this film to anyone, you know, because they really uncovered their deep parts. You know, it was very sensual, and, you know, and of course it was just women there, so we could do that. So that was the first ever Dark Goddess retreat. I think it was in 1988. I was beginning to learn who the Dark Goddesses were. And then I took it to another level. Then I started taking it to different places that I would travel, like San Diego. Once I got a new piece in San Diego. I had a friend down there who was a high priestess of Wicca, and she came, and I said, you've been into this longer than I have, and she's working with the goddesses. Who have I left out? She said, Sekhmet. And that day the bookstore owner gave me a book on Sekhmet. That was about, I don't know, 89 or something, so that's how I got Sekhmet as part of it. So then I started seeing that if you did this in a group of women just on an afternoon even, it didn't have to be a wild weekend, that what happened was you started getting deep things coming up. You know, really old events, old traumas. Like in this bookstore in San Diego, the woman who had the bookstore, who was an older woman, and I had heard she was like a really, you know, strong businesswoman type. She cried. I mean, all kinds of things happened for that day. So I saw that just calling in the energies of the Dark Goddess in itself was very powerful. And so I started doing things in, you know, different areas of California. I started coming here to New Mexico. It was before I lived here, and did a Dark Goddess retreat here about 2 or 3 years before I moved here. I guess it was around 1990 or 1991 was the first one here. And then I had different emotions and experiences correlated with different goddesses. So it was like knowing who to call in if you wanted to get rage or anger, and also by then I was starting to get songs, knowing which songs to bring in. So we could actually do a ritual drum and sing. But as we would call in the goddess, things would happen for people. And it's always different. You never know what's going to happen and who's going to break down. So that was the magic of it. And what I began seeing was that the dark goddess brought through more than individual therapy sessions, counseling, healings, all the things I had been doing for years of my life. Just 2 hours with a dark goddess was enough to do like a year's worth of work. So I really began attuning to them. And even as a group, like I remember the first time I ever did it in New Mexico, it was summer and we were at the treehouse camp. And we did Friday night opening about 7:30. So all we did was just sit in a circle with our drums, smudge, and call in. It was the first calling in of the dark goddesses for that weekend. It started a thunder, it started a lightning, it started a rain. We had to run under a tent. It was like, okay, well, they're here. So just calling them in. A somewhat similar thing happened in Crete. There was quite a bit of resistance at the goddess conference that I was at Crete when I brought up the idea of the dark goddesses and some things about women at the opening panel. There were a lot of older people at this conference, not a lot, but some, not just older people, but people who haven't walked the path I've walked, in terms of feminism and so at the opening panel I talked a little about dark goddesses, and I started talking about things like clitorectomies and things that are happening. And one older woman said, "Can't we talk about nice things?" I thought, oh, I'm not going to shut down for the rest of the conference. So I said, this is reality. I'm here to talk about reality, and if you're into this, you'll come to my workshop. If you're not, don't come. So I knew at that point, this was the opening of the conference, that a lot of people, not a lot, but some were not going to come to my work. And they did, especially some of the older people. And some people came who didn't know much about it, but were really open, like a few of the younger men were there, which was really nice, because people were really scared. They didn't want to look at those dark things in their life. They were, some of them at a conference in Crete to, quote, have a good time, get into the high channeling energy of the goddesses. And so to talk about dark goddesses and rage and anger and what's being done to women, which is part of the dark goddess, was not what they wanted to hear. So for me, the conference was very catalytic because I had to hold that energy of being the catalyst of bringing in the dark, which isn't always comfortable, but it's real important. And so the afternoon we did it, it turned out to be the day of the full moon in October, and we got in this beautiful roundhouse that was at this big hotel on a Minoan sacred site. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and as soon as we called in the goddesses, it started lightning, rain, storm. It was just, and it was great. We had 2 hours with lightning and rain, and with people, I did only 4 goddesses there because I only had about less than 2 hours, but particularly did Medusa and Hecate, because we were in Greece. And some of the people that were there said that was the strongest for them, because we did start off with Pele and Kali, but it sort of built up into where we were really into the Greek energy. And some stuff really came through with people. One man who was there, a young man from Florida, that night at the full moon ritual, he shared during that workshop he had begun to get a twitch in his mouth, which continued throughout the conference. I still don't know what it's about. I haven't heard from him, but some stuff came up for him, some fears that he shared with us, some dreams of snakes. I have everybody share after all the goddess, and then he started this twitch on one side of his mouth, which gave him a distorted mouth for the rest of the conference. To the day he flew back, he still had it a week later. So, these are just the kind of things that happen with the dark goddesses. He could still speak. He was a real open, kind of hip guy, real open, because I think there were only 3 men who came to the workshop. There were only 11 at the conference, and the older men did not come, but 2 of them were ones I could really relate to. And especially when they share their dreams and their fears, and just allow the dark goddess in, because she isn't, she doesn't really have a gender. She is for everyone. She's just there as a catalyst. So men, particularly who are open to working with her, can get a lot, because they're opening to their feminine side, their dreams. You know, their scary dreams. What is it that I'm afraid of? And you can always attribute some fear to one of the goddesses. Who is that? You know, as this guy was talking about his snake dreams, you know, it was all Medusa stuff. And then we related some of his dreams to past life. I got a hit that for him, a lot of his dreams had been past life fears, you know, which do come up in our dreams. And then we hold on to those fears. So part of what the dark goddess does is she purifies, she uncovers those things. So we get in touch with them. And once we get in touch with them, they're no longer in the shadow side. They're in consciousness. And once we know about them, then we can integrate them into the rest of our being. And so instead of going around with these like fears that we don't want to look at, we just go around as being deeper individuals, because we're not afraid to talk about blood and dirt and violence and death and all of those things. I think with the Black Madonnas, at least today, the way we view them, there's this whole controversy over, quote, why they're black, you know, and that again is their connection with indigenous people, who our culture calls third world people instead of first world. You know, we have everything, you know, turned upside down. So if thinking, oh, those are the people that aren't to be counted, they were the people who were slaves in this country anyway, you know, who are oppressed peoples. So I think in that sense, Black Madonnas can represent oppressed peoples. You know, because, I mean, we're told that the original people in Egypt were dark-skinned. So the original mothers were dark in color. You know, maybe not totally black, maybe beige or brown. If you look at Hindu people today, the color of their skin, you know, the Aryan race, which was very close to the beginning, is definitely not white. And I think that's how Black Madonnas, why there's such a controversy or a scare about them. One of them, at the second day when we called in Hecate, and this had nothing to do really with Hecate, but it had to do with probably sitting in circle for 2 days, all of a sudden she got really crying hysterically about some scar on her thigh that her mother had made her have surgery on when she was 11 years old, and she went through all this stuff with her mother, you know, rage. Well, my sense is it wasn't so much Hecate, it was just like, it was the second day of sitting in circle with these energies, and more stuff was coming up for people, so it was getting deeper and deeper, which means childhood. And, you know, she's a woman who's a friend of mine today, so I know her well, but it was like none of us had any inkling she'd been through this. It wasn't anything she'd ever told us about. And all of a sudden it just came out, and she was not just crying, she was really angry at her mother for making her, you know, when she was 11 and not knowing, just have this scar removed. So that's what I mean about breaking down. You don't know who's going to get hit by what. You know, it's so vibrational in a way. And then someone breaks down on one thing, and then sometimes that catalyzes another person in the circle. And I should mention this, you know, with men too, we did it for the first time. It was a very, very small group this summer. We did it with men. Dancing with the Shadow Side, there were only 2 men there besides my friend Tomas, who you met, who was the male facilitator. And at the last circle, this one man told us some amazing things. He's a fairly young man, and he's married, and he said he really enjoyed being married. It was really good. But what he had gotten in touch with the night before when we were dancing around the circle is the part of him that really loves men, that loves dancing with them and loves embracing them. And we had to work through with him and say that was okay. It was totally okay. And Tomas said it's okay even for men to embrace nude. You know, that's okay. It's just like what you do with that energy. Because he was in real conflict. He said, I guess I never saw this part of myself. He said, I mean, it's been there, but I didn't want to see it because, like, I'm married, and, you know, his wife was there, and, you know, and I love my wife, and, you know, we're happy and all, but yet I'm really have this attraction to dancing with men and hugging them and being with them. And that was very profound for him to share that in that circle, even though it was a small, safe circle, because he's a young man who hasn't really done a lot of this processing. Yeah. And so that, to me, that was one of the deepest things that came out of that weekend with the men, was his sharing, you know, because it's part of a lot of men's shadow sides. I'll be branded a homosexual if I dance with them or kiss them, or, you know, and yet I want to do it with men as well as women. I want to be loving. You know, it's a very natural part. So that all came up for him. we were working dark goddess and like dark gods too, but bringing in the shadow side particularly. So it was a surprise. I mean, it was a surprise because who knew that's what was coming through for him all weekend? And then at the closing circle he shared it. He felt safe enough. And we haven't looked at it maybe, or haven't wanted to. Like in his case, he knew it was there. But he hadn't, if you dedicate a weekend to looking at the shadow side, then you're going to there's nothing else to do, no other distractions. You're going to look at it and say, well, does that fit, and why do I have it? And then once you bring it on the light and you share it with other people, it's no longer your shadow. So I think this is, I'm sure, what the pilgrimages with the Black Madonna will do too. It's that looking at her, working with her, things that people just don't even know are there come up. For not mothering them, and also for putting values on them that were, quote, cosmetic, like not letting her natural scar be there. But, it wouldn't look good when she was older, whatever those reasons were. And as she's sort of been grown up to be what I'll call an earth person, not caring that she had a scar, it wasn't going to matter to her. But in those days, she was 11, had to obey the mother that said it won't look good when you're older. It's like braces on your teeth and things like that. Things that are put on us because society says this is the way things should look. I just read an incredible poem today. This is coming through very strongly. I just got this little package from a friend I haven't seen in years. She's a woman, an older woman who lives in Nevada City, where I used to live out on the ridge in a community. She was part of the farm, Stephen Gaskin's farm, for years. And I know her story. I know about her 2 kids and the hate and all that. She wrote a poem that she's been read at some readings up there in, this is, in the Sierras, called something like I Hear You, Rodney King, which is absolutely awesome. It brought me into tears this afternoon when the mail came. And it's about when she was living in Venice and being a hippie, how the LA police put her in jail and took her kids, her 4-month-old that she was nursing, and her son who was 5 years old, even though some friends tried to dye his hair and get him, out of the area, because they thought she wasn't being a good mother, because, as she says in the poem, she was allowing them freedom. Because when they checked her house, there were some vulgar words up, and she didn't have a TV set. And so she talks about giving her milk to the toilet in the state penitentiary. And this woman is 4 planets in Cancer. I mean, and she's in her 60s, but I knew her when she was in her late 50s. And she is a total earth mother. She's always, she worked with the kids from the farm. She's living in a community with young kids doing rituals. And she's just incredible. And I just reading that poem when it came a few hours ago, because, she told me a lot about her life. I'd done some deep session work with her, but I didn't remember or hear this story about her kids being taken. She wasn't being like the typical mother. She finally got them back after 6 months. They were put in foster home, she said, with a Burbank minister. Because, she was living a hippie life, whatever that means. It was different standards, smoking and things like that. And her kids were totally fine. She was a single mother, because she said to Rodney King, she says in the poem, not because I was a black, but because I was a woman, a hippie, a single mother, didn't have a TV set. All these standards. That's a lot what the Dark Goddess is about. She was living her truth and got her into jail and lost her kids. And so that is still happening in our society, those kind of things. Maybe better, maybe worse, but still happening. Now we're going to put them in orphanages, if, according to the new politicians, just take them from the mothers, put them in orphanages. Well, for one thing, because blackness is night and night is dark and we can't see, and that's very scary. So often things associated with the night, like the owl, in Native American, it's a very sacred bird, and you can only have owl feathers at certain times, or the raven, is connected with magic. And magic is, in our society, called occult, hidden, not to be looked at, And then also black has also been associated with people of color, so that's another negative about black. Instead of seeing it, for like achievement, like in the Oriental arts, the black belts, judo and karate are like achievement. And also because in our society we happen to wear black for mourning. So that, and also we haven't really, until recently, accepted death and dying in any way. So black comes in, oh, that's bad, that's death, instead of white is, the light and peaceful. But in the Orient, I found this out years ago when I was working with crystals, in the Orient, white is the color of mourning, because they drink this tincture of pearl in Japan for a year after they lose a relative, and that's white. So see, they have it just turned around. The black belts are for achievement, and if you're in mourning, you wear white and you drink a tincture of pearl. But I think it's Western culture that has made black that. I don't think that's as true in the Orient. Because in the Orient, if you notice, there's always Kali, there's always in Bali, I don't know if you saw my little black masks and my black altar that's down here, but there's always like a horrible face, even in the beautiful, peaceful culture of Bali. There's always, like a weird black mask or something in every dance drama. Because you can't talk about yin without yang. You can't look at light without shadows. I mean, we make a shadow as we walk. You can't just isolate it. And I think this is like a really deep point. I think it's a really important point for so-called New Age, because a lot of the New Age is really geared to ascension. Ascension and channeling, which is leaving behind the body, which is, there's this whole thing of trying to get in the light and leaving beyond the dark. And when you really go down to what the dark is the earth. The dark is the mother. The white and the light is like going to Sky Father, which again eliminates the mother. This is like how Western society has treated the earth, abused her, raped the earth. And so they don't want to look at that. And last year in one of the circles I was doing with these women, one of them is from Scotland, and she was really interested in divas and working with divic energies. And she told us a story of how she went to the Ark, which is the bookstore in Santa Fe, and could not find any books on divas. There were shelves and shelves of books on angels. So I finally found a few and told her about it, because that's like her traditions coming from Scotland, because the divic energies are part of the earth. See, they're not part of the sky, the angelic hosts. And I think it's a really, really subtle thing that's come into new thought, New Age thinking, is this idea that we have to let go of the body, which is the Christian idea. The body isn't supposed to be sacred, it's not sensual, just don't pay much attention to it, but just do higher spiritual practices. And to me, a lot of the, about ascension and going into fourth dimension and Pleiadian energy, all of that is sometimes off balance, because it's not working with the physical body, with the temple. It's like denying the spirit. And I spoke about this actually a few weeks ago at the celebration on Sunday morning, about the goddess energy being the descension into the labyrinth, and what the labyrinth is about. It's a very potent symbol in Minoan Crete, and I really got into it every day living there in Crete and Greece, of how if you're with the energy every moment, you are going into a labyrinth, which means you have to totally trust, because you don't know what's going to happen. It's where the intuition comes in. And this hotel we were at, which was just built in Crete, it was this enormous place on the ocean, but on an old Minoan sacred site. And where you stayed were like in little villages. But there were hardly any signs. So going to your room every day was going into the labyrinth. It was like, can I find my room? Because each circle of buildings would go up to 300. So where did you enter the labyrinth? Like my room was 105, and if I was really tuned in, I could enter near the hundreds. But if it was a rainy night, I was cold or nervous or tired, I could enter in the 300s and have to keep walking. So that just showed me every day, 4 times a day, what the labyrinth is about. That if you go in with total trust, you find your way. And if you go in, tired, upset, in a hurry, you get lost. And it takes you longer to find what you're going to. And that's what part of the Black Madonna Dark Goddess is. It's going into the labyrinth. It's descension instead of ascension. Am I willing to go into the dark? Am I willing to hang out with that inner place in me, which is nighttime, which is dark, which is underground, which is the cave, which is the Earth Mother, without the light of the sun. And without what the light of the sun represents, which is logic and rationality, am I willing to go in with just my feelings and know that I'll get out? See, that's the key. Edgar Allan Poe is a good one because he didn't know it. He was into the Dark Mother. Remember reading in high school The Cask of Amontillado, and I did a story based on that. Burying someone I didn't like at the time. It's my Scorpio rising. I loved it. I mean, I loved him. Everyone was saying he's horrible, he's gruesome, but wow, it was really exciting because he dealt with things that other things in our literature books didn't. Which was this energy that I feel we're reclaiming it now. It's like reclaiming the earth. I think that's why the interest in the black Madonnas, the dark goddesses, are happening, because it's our roots. We can't just live, in the sky, without bodies. It's like being disembodied. And you know what a great book is that I just finished reading, she really nails them all, is Monica Schu's latest book, New Age and Armageddon, The Gurus of the Goddess. I don't know if you've read it, but yeah, it's like wonderful. It was a book I brought to Crete and I just finished it. Yeah, she really gets into it, Finhorn on down. This shows a lot of it, maybe in an extreme way, but she's really pointing up, where it's coded, it's like a icing. It's a patriarchal icing. No matter what they say, this is New Age, New Thought. It's the same old sky stuff, and not the Earth Mother stuff. What bothers some of us is that a lot of New Thought people, quote, modern, free spirit people, do not recognize that. They're buying into it because it's new, and they're not seeing that it's the same thing. That's why I spoke on the celebration about dissension, to see, and there were definitely people there who got it. It's like being willing to go into the dark. In order to be really joyous, to be really happy in life, you have to have descended. Because if you don't go through the dark, you don't know the light at the end of the tunnel. It's people say, well, I'll do it without suffering. Good luck, I'm not going to suffer. I don't want to feel the pain. Those are the people, their houses burn down, they get robbed, they lose a friend through AIDS or cancer, because there's no way to avoid pain. You see, and until you know pain in some form, you can't know joy, because it's the same thing, really. And so the purpose of dissension is, I see it two ways. I see that some people go willingly. They take on a meditation retreat, a vision quest, a pilgrimage, and they say, I'm going to do it. I'm going to look at my stuff. And I think that's great, but not everyone is willing to do it. And those who don't go willingly get hit, usually. Whether it's death, a house burning. I mean, some of us go willingly and get hit too. I mean, no one's immune. But, it's like, I find the people who get hit the hardest are those who haven't wanted to look at the shadow side. That's years ago when I used to do a lot of work with cancer. To me, that was the thing behind the life-threatening illnesses. You keep stuffing your stuff under the rug. You keep putting it under the rug, and all of a sudden it smells so bad under the rug. It's like, look at me, I've got cancer. I've got something really heavy now, because I wasn't willing to look at it all along. And then you got to go under the rug and start cleaning it out. It's like going into the closet. So like people who say, I'm not going to deal with dissension, I'm not going to deal with the dark, the painful, they get it anyway. It's just, being an astrologer, I always say, give them one good Pluto transit and it's just going to come, the smell is just going to come up. So it's really hard to hide it. Finding your authenticity and your true voice, like being willing to walk one's talk, to speak the truth, which isn't always easy in a society that, in our society we haven't, until Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, really been willing to look at death, to look at sex, and I always say to look at colonics. Those are the three: death, sex, and colonics, because it's the same thing. People go, oh, God, colonics, enemas, the colon. It's the shit part. They don't want to look at that, but it's all the same energy. In astrology, it's all Pluto and Scorpio. It's the underground. They don't want to look at what they've stuffed in here. And so even to me, who am a believer in colonics among health practices, having a colonic can be an extremely incredible experience for people, because what happens on a psychic level is that all the emotions that have been stuffed in the colon come up. So it's not just getting rid of old material physically. I remember my first colonic years and years ago was a profound experience. Absolutely. And then I later learned that our country, America, United States, has the highest incidence of colon cancer in the world, because people keep their emotions here. So it's like what we're trying to do is unblock that. It's like, let's look at it. We don't need to hold it in. We can look at it even if it's dark, painful, sexual, all those things. Smells bad. And a lot of that, and that's another thing about the Black Madonna, Dark Goddess, has been put, all those bad things, all those yucky, dark things, has been put on woman. Just in the gender of woman for years. Like, she's the one who seduces man away from the good path. She's the whore, she's the this, she's the one who's temperamental, she bleeds. All of those things. So that's what women have been fighting about, is to bring in balance. Just like the black people have got it, the female, gender has got it. And all the way back from Mary Magdalene, she was the prototype of the whore. And there's still that dichotomy, certainly in the West, with the good wife, the whore. I call it Eve and Lilith. That's another designation. And Eve is the good wife who was willing to be carved from Adam's rib and sleep beneath him. And Lilith said, "No, I'm going with the beasts and the demons." She was the dark goddess. I won't do it. So she was free, and she lived with the nature creatures. And she was never. Lilith is the one goddess who has never been celebrated as a goddess. She was always considered a demon, because she was off, with the birds, the beasts, the animals in the field, and accused of doing all, copulating with animals and things, because she had like the spirit of nature. And because she was a rebel, because she said no to Adam. She was the first woman to say no. That's why she's become so popular now. It's the saying no. Lilith was, a lot of the Lilith literature comes from the Zohar, which is one of the books of the Kabbalah. But before that, she was actually mentioned in Babylonia. She was mentioned in Sumeria. She was a handmaiden to Inanna. That's the first ever mention of Lilith, way back in Sumeria, as Inanna's handmaiden. So she was totally cherished and worshipped. But in the Judaic work, in the Zohar, she became, at a certain point, first she was really acknowledged, she was like the same as the Shekinah, which is like the Jewish goddess. But then Lilith became the consort of Samael, who was the devil. So that schism developed, God up here, devil down there. And she became like the wife or consort of Samael, so she was like the underground devil. And so she represented all that was dark, all that was, quote, passionate in female, things of the night, because her feet, in the representations of Lilith, her feet are like birds' feet, and she has owl's wings. So she was totally associated with the creatures of the night. So that's probably at that time that those books of the Kabbalah were written. We're probably dealing with the age of the patriarchs, the 12 tribes of Israel, which was the age, although most of us grew up thinking this was wonderful in the Old Testament, this was the putting down the goddess cultures. This is when the tribes were all male and patriarchal. And so some of that Kabbalistic literature, though it was the mystical literature, so it's good that it's preserved, but that's where Lilith is. See, she got put down. All the cultures that, were in the Near East, all still had the goddesses, whether it was Ishtar, they all had some version, Inanna, Ishtar, Esther, and even the Jews did. Because Esther, Queen Esther, who's in the Purim myths, is Esther, is Ishtar, is Inanna, is Venus, is Aphrodite. It's all the same. It's just, just like the saints, they had to make Bridget a saint and so forth. The Jews did the same thing. And they didn't know they were doing it. They made these goddesses into their queens. So Queen Esther really holds that energy. It's interesting because now we have the insights to go back and see how these things are all connected. Sacred sites are interesting because within the land, the energies are still there, the vibrational energies, and it's sort of up to us who go to the sacred sites to attune. It's what Rupert Sheldrake calls it the morphogenetic field. The field is there. So it's like, what tools do we use to attune, and how can that enhance our understanding? So my sense is that they're really important to go back to those places, because you get a lot on a feeling level, even literally if you can't see the structures that were there. You can feel the kinds of energies. And for me it was interesting because I'm not always psychically that open when I'm, you know, traveling or with groups. I'm grounded. I'm an earth sign, so I'm not just receiving all that, but to begin to get balanced in a grounded way, but also like going to these sacred sites in Crete, for example, and saying, well, what does this one feel like? Well, this is a very peaceful site. At this site called Malta for our closing ritual of this conference. And then it was very peaceful, but it wasn't heavy duty. It wasn't intense. And then we found out later that it was a site where they did music. They just did their music and prayers. They didn't even live there, you know. So it was just like, oh, well, that makes sense, because it just was real easy, that particular place, you know. And so I think that's what we're sort of doing, is saying, well, not just looking at the physical remains, you know, but the energy fields. What were they doing here? What was the energy? What, you know, ley lines, what power spots were running through? What made them come up with this? You know, each area is different, because if it's an island, if it's on the sea, I mean, seeing places in Crete were different from the mainland in Greece, you know, just because of the way it also was a different culture, the Minoan, but the way it's spaced out along the water is different. And I found that in islands too, being in Bali, that islands, you know, with all the water, run a very strong psychic energy. It's like a lot of telepathic communication, because the island is like an energy into itself. And so you can be on one side and communicate with people on another. And it's very interesting, and think about people and meet them in the same places. I've had a lot of those experiences, particularly on Bali, because it being part of another culture. See, in Crete, the overlays there, you've got to work through a lot of layers, because the modern Greeks are there, living and doing their thing. And the modern Greeks, I found out, are pretty patriarchal, you know. So you've got to pull that off as much as you can. You still have to deal with them, of course, you know, to try to get into the Cretan Minoan energy, which you can get at some of the sacred sites, and you can also really get at the museum. I mean, seeing the pieces, you know, not just the sacred sites, but like the artwork. You know, seeing some of the goddesses, you can pull it off that. But you have to work harder, you know, to get it. And I think this is true in Europe a lot, because but if you're in a culture like Bali, which is still very preserved, the old culture, the goddess there, the rituals, the temples, they still do all those things all the time. So you don't have to go around pulling it off to get into it. You just, it's very easy. That's why in Bali, people feel very relaxed, because you don't have to do a lot of work. You know, it's a very old form of Hinduism, not the Indian brand that has the caste system, but it's more combined with animism. So it's very nature-centered, you know, very oriented around nature, and then the nature spirits. So it's very easy to slip into. My understanding is that ley lines are like, they're magnetic energies on the Earth's surface that cross and double cross, and they're like, you know, like we could call it electrical grids or power lines, but they're not electrical grids. It's almost like if you did, in a human being, if you go through a human being's body, you see all these meridians, you know, acupuncture points. Well, the Earth is like that too. She has these meridians, and they're called, I'm not sure why they're called ley lines, the origin of that word, but it's sort of like the power grids. And so a lot of the sacred sites are on these, and as you mentioned last night, a lot of the Black Madonnas are, you know, are in churches along these lines. And also, do you remember at the conference, Lucia Birnbaum was saying how in Italy a lot of the Black Madonnas were where it was very left-wing politically, so that also would correspond with, quote, the ley lines there, you know, where there were centers of real free-spiritedness. That's where the Black Madonnas still were, and that's where they were much more politically rebellious and open. That energy was allowed to be there without being repressed so much. You know, because Christianity and Judaism and some of the other religions repressed all the especially the nature, you know, the earth energies, the earth worship. So it's now, they're still there. I mean, even in Europe, there's still the Yule ceremonies and so many things which are really pagan customs, you know, that have just been brought over into the church to sort of accommodate the people. But they don't make any separation now and say, well, this was the older, you know, because it's become part of it. They just sort of overlay. And that's how the cathedrals were built. They were overlaid on all the sacred sites. So they were, it was almost like the places were all there for them. They were all set up. a lot happens with the earth doing ceremonies at the sacred sites, because a lot of it is for healing the old energies. Because the earth has experienced a lot of trauma, both to herself, like the first plow. I mean, that was part of the desecration of the earth. In the male shadow book, I was reading all these books on like the Green Man. The first plow ripped open the earth. It was an assault. It was a rape on the earth. And from then on, all the other machinery. So, for one thing, physically, she's been harmed in that way. But more than physically, psychically, emotionally, the abuse that people have had to other people, you know, on an emotional level, on a psychic level, is all retained there. So by doing ceremonies and rituals, it's like clearing it. It's like purifying it, healing it, you know, in the sense of bringing positive energy, letting go, just like you would do for a person who had bad memories or bad traumas. You would put in good memories. You would do ritual to let go of your childhood bad memories. Well, the same with the earth. She retains them. And one of the things that I heard about years ago, I have a friend, an older woman in California. She's an older Japanese woman who was really known for doing Jinshin-do on people years ago, you know. And so then, about 6 or 7 years ago, she started to travel throughout the world. She was traveling with Marcel Vogel and using these high-powered crystals. And what they were doing was working on all these places. She said the same way she'd work on a body, the meridians. And she told me about some of the places, like in Ireland at one point. The amount of grief and torture there was incredible. So they were working with crystals, not just doing ritual, but working with crystals on what she called all the acupuncture points of the earth, to help heal the earth. And at one point, I remember her telling me this great story once. She came to a book signing of mine, because she lives in the Bay Area where I used to live. And she said, we were just in Oakland today doing some healing. You know, we did some dowsing of the map, and we went to certain places that came up with our crystals. She said, and do you know where the biggest gap was in Oakland? I said, tell me, I can imagine. It was right where the last earthquake had broke across the Cypress Freeway. And that's where they ended up. And so when they had just did it, according to the map, they ended up in the same physical place where the freeway had split. So again, it's like going back to ley lines. And when, you know this when you study dowsing and all, when the energies are off, like when a lot of accidents happen in the same place, you know that it's because of the lines going off, and you've got to do things to correct that in some way, and that's geomancy, and it's working with feng shui so that it gets back in balance. So that's what they ended up doing, and this was maybe 6 or 7 months after that '89 earthquake had happened. They ended up right at that place, and that's where the lines and energies were all. How do you get modern technology to start to use, and some people are being really open to things like feng shui and, you know, to some of these ancient arts, because it's totally dealing with the energies of the land, which means certain times you can't impose things. You have to let the little stream of water trickle there. You can't really build a big lake or a dam because because you're interfering. And so it's like flowing with those energies. And that's, you know, tied in again to the sacred sites, flowing with them, using the healing energies there on the earth. So it's much more than just people healing or doing a ritual. It's definitely about healing the earth, and not just healing the earth, but attuning to her. You know, where does she want certain things built? There's certain places it's not appropriate to put a house. You know, on a windy knoll. Look at the Bay Area, all these houses in the rain and the mudslides all the time, because they're all on these stilts over, you know. And then they slide down into the mud, and people wonder why, you know. It's just, yeah. The first thing I think that's really important before going to one of these places is really read about it. Like, read its history, you know, so that you have some knowledge of what were the kinds of things that were done there, who lived there, what kind of sacred sites, what was the energy, you know, just to really learn something about the culture. So that way, instead of going with your own mindset, you're imbibing, you know, you're going with as much as you can before you're even there and feeling it, of what that culture was about, of how they did things. You know, I mean, some people walk in straight lines, some people walk in curved lines diagonally. You know, there's a difference. It's like in Greece, you know, there's a lot of the labyrinth movement. I mean, you just discover it in the Minoan culture. So you start walking more that way than in a straight line. So it's like coming to it with that spirit. It's like the spirit of place. Before you're going to do rituals or whatever, you know, either heal yourself or heal the earth, trying to really attune to what was there. See, because then you get in harmony with that piece of land and with the cultural vibrations. And that way I think you can get the most benefit. For one thing, they have to be aware and sensitive to it and know what it is. It's like you said, a lot of people didn't know what a lot of people just think it's your stuff, it's from your mother, your childhood. You know, people don't have what I call that cosmic consciousness to know what energies are really coming up from the collective unconscious and what's personal. So there has to be that awareness in order to have other people work with it. Once there's that awareness, then people can work with it by attuning to similar energies. You know, feeling, oh, this is the rage that was existent throughout time among women. It's just another manifestation of that rage, and then allow her to get it out. You know, not repress it, not take her away from the circle, but kind of like sing and dance around it, you know, move to it, drum it out, things like that. You know, so that, because it's like we're all dealing with energy forms. So releasing energy. I mean, one of the ways, like at a Kali ritual, I remember working with Kali where a lot of the anger and hurt was coming out, was all of a sudden some of us just went into the chant Kali Durga, because that chant has a lot of compassion and love in it. Whereas it also shows the strength of Kali, but there's a tremendous amount of compassion there. So that we all become part of it. It's not like, oh, you've got this stuff. It's like, we all have it. We're just not expressing it in the way this person needed to. You know, but I think that through singing, through chants, through drumming, through sound, toning, you know, we can become one collective and bring the person in instead of saying, no, that's your stuff, get outside the circle. You know, my sense is bring them in, and often the quickest way is through some kind of sound, drumming, you know, moving, toning, rather than verbal, because it takes a lot of time for each person to share a similar experience. So just like immediately, I always start with music and sound, drumming, move that energy in, and then all of a sudden, you know, some healing occurs just through the sound. Perhaps you're only living a very small part of your life. Maybe your life is very good and very happy in the part you're living, and that's fine. So we all acknowledge that's fine. But it's not very deep. You know, it may be like you're living 1/10 of your potential, and there's another 9/10. So if you were willing to look a little deeper, you might experience your joys in a much deeper way. You know, be able to be much more fulfilled. Relate to many more kinds of people. It's like going from a little small speck, you know, a vision. Well, this is my land, I live here, this is all I see. Wow, now I can relate to everyone in the world. You know, it's just like I can relate to people who are in jail, I can relate to political prisoners, people who have AIDS, people who have cancer. If you don't want to, it's your choice. But, you know, if you're willing to go a little deeper and open yourself up, then your joys will be deeper. You know, in your experience of life, you'll be able to communicate with more people. And I think the main thing is you'll have compassion. To me, that's the real reason for going to the Dark Mother, to develop compassion. Because if we stay in our own little safe worlds, then we don't experience a lot. We can't look out. We can't be with all kinds of people. We can't know. We don't have to be in jail to know what it's like in jail. We just need to go deep to know what that's like, or to be tortured. We don't literally have to be tortured, but we can experience it through compassion and empathy. And that's what the Dark Mother's about. She says, open up, be empathetic, and then you can transform humanity. But you can't do it from just standing on the top of the mountain doing visualizations. You know, you got to get into the dirt and the muck. You know, it just isn't going to work that way. Yeah? Our everyday lives, there's a tremendous amount that's happening that some of us are aware of and some aren't. You know, you can, if you work at a job, maybe just go to your job, come home, watch your TV, take care of your kids, and block out all the rest. It's very hard, though, especially with the media now, to block out the suffering. So, but if you decide to take it in and to use that, then you can say, ooh, look, there's a plane crash here today, or there's here, and you can start immediately sending out that healing. That's why I read the paper at breakfast every morning. People for years have thought, I've been crazy. What? You read the newspaper at breakfast? What a way to start the day. I said, what better way? I need to know where to send the healing. I need to know what's going on in the world. Because if I'm just going to sit here in my own little meditation shell, I mean, I could send energy or white light to the world, but that wouldn't be very specific and effective. But if I know there's a plane crash in North Carolina, and if I know this is happening in Bosnia, I can be much more directed in my own personal day-by-day life. I can be alone here, say writing, or just go out to a few stores. I don't have to encounter a lot of people to be doing work with healing or, empathy or compassion. I mean, there's a million things every day to be working on. So it's like once you're open to that cosmic level, you include a lot more. You start like psychically connecting with people in those places and countries, sending them healing. I mean, you start doing a lot of work. And I think that's how you use it in your daily life. Unless you want to stay in a little box, just do your thing, come home, just, never turn on TV, never look at the newspapers, not be aware of anything else in the world. But that's very hard to do for anybody who has any degree of feeling or consciousness, not to be aware that other people are homeless, other people don't have food, even if they're provided for. It's hard to shut that out. A lot of Native Americans have been over there teaching practices, and there's certain countries, particularly for some reason Germany, I'm told, where Sun Bear's books got translated first before any other country. Germans translated my books first, Earth Mother Astrology. Women's Medicine Ways, by the way, just got German rights. It's interesting. Well, there is a lot of the population that speaks German, but still, it's interesting that the need there seems the greatest. And maybe because the northern countries, the Germanic countries, are a little more, intellectual, where some of the southern countries, France, Italy, and Spain, have a little more of the feeling, and certainly Greece, the intuition. So maybe the Germans have needed it the most. But obviously that's where all this is the biggest, the Native American teachings, because the Native Americans are still living in this country today. Those traditions are still there. So even though they have been, bulldozed into little reservations and all the other things that have been done to them by the other culture that came into this land, Turtle Island, nevertheless, they've still maintained. So it's like living examples. You see, it's something, whereas it's different in Europe, because in Europe the Christianity has overlaid paganism, and other than maybe a small little pagan community, they're not really living and multiplying. It's different. So they can see in Native American practices how it's done when you keep your old ways, when you attune to the earth, when you do rituals blessing the earth, equinox and solstice, when you observe the cycles, when you honor the earth and you honor all your relations. The competitiveness, the greed, all of those things don't come in. Guadalupe is special because I don't think of her quite as a dark goddess. I think Guadalupe has a very Kuan Yin side. You know what I mean? Like the mother of the world. To me, she's both light and dark. I mean, she may have dark skin or seen like as, actually an Indian, in where she was first, appeared in vision. She did have dark skin and was Indian. But I think of Guadalupe not just as the taking care of the chaos and purification, but I think of her very much as the compassion. The heart and the love. So I think that's why she's attractive to many people, is because in a sense she merges both. It's not, there are literally, if we go through the cultures, there are some solar goddesses and there are some lunar goddesses. And then there are some that are both, and earth goddesses. To me, Guadalupe is everything. I mean, she's an earth goddess, but she's both solar and lunar. She has the ability, I think, to work with the dark things, but I think that she has a lot to do with compassion, the way I get her anyway. A tremendous amount to do with heart and compassion, and so I do think of her a little bit with Kuan Yin sometime, and not just like the heavy, the heavy purification stuff is like Kali or, and Pele, blow up the volcano, my rage. But I don't see Guadalupe quite like that at all. I mean, she's, her energy's different. Guadalupe was the very ancient Aztec goddess. And to me, Guadalupe like evolved from that. So she encompasses, because Guadalupe and who's the other goddess? Chicomecoltl. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but she was also Aztec. They both had a real lunar side and a real connection, like with animals, like the slide you showed last night. You remember the feet, the animal thing. Well, to me, Guadalupe was an evolution of that, because she's very human in her representation. You know what I mean? She's very feminine. She's not what I call Lilith-like in that way. So she's a little more evolved form, and that's good, because, see, then she can appeal to the masses, because the masses are not going to embrace a goddess who is owl feet or bird's wing. I mean, that's like a little too weird for them. They're probably not going to carry something around in their processions that's very animal-like. So Guadalupe to me needed to come in very human form and have very human emotions, because people can identify with a goddess who is like them, who looks like them, you know, hair like them, facial features, you know, who feels things, that sort of thing. So that's just, I don't know enough about, I haven't hung out enough in Central and South America yet. It's coming this year, for yet to feel her from the inner among the people. You know, this is, I'm just saying from how I experienced her in this land of New Mexico, in the Kivas where I've been, where she's real prominent, you know, how she's come to me. So my experience with her is still limited. That is how I feel about a lot of Black Madonnas. It's been tempered. It's not the wildness and craziness in its raw form, because it couldn't be, or they couldn't be around. People can't handle that. But it's just enough to bring the seeds. It's like the gypsy pilgrimage, you know, where they can be wild and all, so she can be at least dark, you know. You know what I mean? They can allow her that much, like the Sarah Kali, that her skin is dark. But you know, they're not going to allow, not in the Western world, you're not going to get a Kali type, Durga type energy in, or Lilith. You know, it's just, couldn't come in yet, because it's much too scary for people, much too scary, you know, to unburden their sensuality, to, you know, free us. So I would say the furthest the Western world could go now would be the Black Madonna. That's the, you know, it's still, she's very human, very compassionate, and she's still a mother, you know, all those things. So that's all very acceptable. You know, she just conceals, like, if you look to the dark side, then you can see the wildness and passion, which is obviously what the gypsies attuned to. See, they bring that out because that's in their blood. They know that. So that's true about the Black Madonna. They're afraid of those things. It's just like people used to say that, you know, Kali too, in India, when she wears like the necklace of skulls. Well, it isn't, I've been told just by people who go to India, and this is true, it's not skulls, it's not people she's killed, that's not why she wears the necklace, it's for protection. She protects these beings, that's why she wears it. It's not because she's out there knocking them off, you know, it's the protection. You know, so that's real important. But people don't get that. A skull is a skull. You know, I mean, that's scary, it's death, it's not something we want to look at. That's the sword, that's that she's carrying the sword, you see. That's the strength, like the expression Stacy used last night, that being one unto herself, you know, not needing any other, like, relationships or people. That's the strength part, you know, you know, mess with me or cross my boundaries, you know. But that's underneath it. That's not what people see first, because that would be scary a little bit. Because if they saw that in her first, some of them come to, then that's saying you have to be like that. You have to come into your own inner strength. You have to walk your talk. The first Dark Goddess retreat we ever did that I told you about earlier in 1988, I stayed an extra night at Isis Oasis. I stayed over there to do the finances and all that the next day with the owner. And I don't dream a lot. When I have a dream, it's very important. And that night I had a very powerful dream. And in the dream, it wasn't a dark goddess who came to me. It was like an old bearded sage, you know, sort of man. Showed me the house that I was currently living in, which was in California, Marin County, and said, from here you can see where you're going to move to. And the words I heard were Albany. Albany was like a little town across the bay from where I lived in the East Bay near Oakland. And it was very specific, said this move will be easy for you. And you can, I lived way up in the hills where I live. You can see it from your window. And I woke up and I went, what is this dream about? Because I was one of the few people there that year at that retreat who had no, you know, obvious changes in my life, meaning I wasn't splitting up a relationship, I wasn't moving, etc. You know, my work was more or less the same. So I get this dream after working a weekend with the Dark Goddess. And I said, well, I have to look at it. What does it mean? It's a very strong message to move. And so I made this agreement. The agreement was with the Dark Goddess, even though it wasn't her form in the dream. It was from her energy. I never would have had that dream, probably, if I hadn't done the whole weekend. So my agreement was, I've never done anything like this before, but I will follow this dream. So I knew, in a few months I would start to look for this house. Well, the house, it wasn't exactly in the geographical location called Albany. It was in a place called El Cerrito, which borders on Albany. So it was pretty close. I found the house and lived in it for 3 years or 3.5 before coming here. So, you know, it was just like that to me was a dark goddess dream, even though the dark goddess wasn't in it. It was a dream of change, and it wasn't a change I was at all conscious of. I mean, I didn't need to move at the time. I didn't have any conflict with where I was living, except that it was a little small. And I had probably some fears about going over the East Bay because the energy was it wasn't mellow, it was a lot heavier, you know, but something was calling me for my work there. So it really came through on a very deeply unconscious level through that dream. And, you know, it was the only time I said, I thought I'm doing something for it, and I'm just following a dream. I'm not saying, do I need to move? Should I move? Why should I move? The dream told me to, let's just see what happens if I do it. And I did it, and did find a much, much larger place to live in, which was one of the ideas, so, you know, by following it. So that was a dark goddess dream in a way. I knew what the dark goddess was about, having worked on her for that first time in my life at the retreat, when we defined her, because we did a radio show at the same time. So I could give you a tape of that, make that be what the dark goddess was, and then we each presented. It was on KPFA, and one of the things was what she was about was change. And that's what a lot of us fear. We kind of like our houses, our relation, you know, etc. And so she says change, grow, transform. So we're uncomfortable with her, so sometimes we shove her out of the way. So we don't have to change. Just, you know, when you came back from your trip, I remember you saying, you know, it really hit you. Yeah. So for me, my first weekend spent with a dark goddess, and I got that dream. And followed it. That's why the snake is such a symbol of the goddess. And so feared. I mean, we fear snakes so much in our society. It's such an ambiguous symbol because of the fear, but also because that we need to get in touch with snakes. I always use the image of being in the tunnel or the cave and coming out in the light. When you're in it, it's very hard. And I always say to people, just have faith. You will come out. You will come out into the light. And this is interesting. It wasn't a dream, but it's something that's, oh, so synchronistic. Every time you hit the Black Madonna in whatever form she manifests. I came home last night from your slideshow, not even thinking of, you know, anything like that in my life. And I had some phone messages. And the first phone message was a woman who I had connected with real deeply in Bali. She lives in California. She taught Tantra there. It was a message her son, the night before, she wanted to tell me, had just passed over from AIDS. Now, I knew he had AIDS. She had told me that. It was her adopted son. He was in his early 30s. And she just went on for a long time on the phone machine, how they really did what they set out to do, how she was with him for the whole month, how they did it in just the way he wanted, asking me to please light a candle for him, that his separation from his body, she felt, had been easy. And, you know, and then she cried a bit on the phone and just said a few things and sent me a lot of love and just asked me. And, you know, and then I had another phone message of something else, someone just crying about some problem from another state. And I got off, and my first hit was, here it is. You know, I come home, the Black Madonna, and I mean, I hadn't even thought of her consciously in weeks or months. I think I last talked to her in September. She said, my son's going to come to live with me. I want him to be here. Well, through this, but it was like, you know, it's like every time you work with that energy in some form, it manifests. Death is transformation. It's letting go of the physical body. You know, it's not annihilation the way some people think. As I explain it to my mother, because I know, you know, she's in her 80s and getting ready for years. I've been telling her, you go to a different band on the radio dial. You're still around. You're just on a different vibration, you know. But that is very scary to people because it is transformation. It is shedding the physical body. You know, so it's all the way we look at it. It doesn't have to be scary. It can just be another transformation, you know, like the snake skin, like the butterfly. But for some people feel it's the end because they're totally into material consciousness. You know, it's the end of my physical body, so it's annihilation, so I don't want to die. You know. So there's a lot around that. Yeah. I read this great interview from Common Ground in California the other night. They still send it to me. It was with Marlo Morgan, and it was about the Australian Aborigines, and she said how they know so exactly when it's their time. They sit down on the ground, they change their vibration, they change their temperature and their circulation, and they just go. You know, they have such command over their body processes that they know, they just, I think she said lower their temperature or something, and she said they change their circulation, and, you know, it's like that's it. It's that simple. For us, it's, you know, we're not that trained in those psychic ways, you know, to quickly change from one state. So even if we know it's our time, it's much harder because we have to go through sometimes lots of weeks or time to really get to those places. unless we're really trained. But see, that's the epitome of training, is to just know and just sit down and, just change a few little, it's like adjusting a few knobs and you're in the next state. And fearful of it because they don't know how. It's like, I really want to go up in a plane, but I don't know how to navigate it, We have no idea. The Western world has no idea. Some of the mystical traditions do, know how to concentrate and, break the cord and different things. But it's, it's very nebulous. It's very hard to get to that. She can help people if they open up to her, if they acknowledge that there is that other level, and because she represents that, just the darkness, and also because she has the compassion. She can say, come into me and don't be afraid, just as I change my color or whatever, so if people open up to her, because death, what we call that English word death, it's just another transformation. So just as she helps with other transformations, she can certainly help with literal, letting go of the shell. Again, if people are willing to open up to her. You say we always have a shadow. We may for some of us, but for some people who have really unpeeled the layers of the onion, it's different. It's not like a repressed part of ourselves, because that's what the shadow is. It's true what you're saying. Literally, we can still shadow, which means to, if we're very yin, we'll have a yang part of us. But I think it's a difference of whether it's repressed or not. So it's like to say, okay, this is who I am, and I acknowledge there's certain things that are hard for me, or areas of fear, like, getting whatever lost on a mountain or vision quest or whatever. But if those things are really acknowledged and worked with and they're not repressed, it's a different. See what I'm saying? Because it's been brought up. It's been brought out into the light. So even though it may trail behind you as, yes, we all have our fears. There couldn't be yang without yin, We have our sensitivities, our emotional vulnerabilities. But I don't consider that real heavy shadow stuff when it's worked with, because it's conscious. It's if you're aware of it and say, like, I'm going to climb this mountain because mountain climbing is something I really have a fear of. That's different from having in the shadow and being brought a mountain. Oh my God, I'm freaked out because I've never told anyone that I'm really afraid to do this. It's different. It's like working with it consciously. So people who are working with it, I don't call it so much the shadow. I just, see it as the yin and yang. That there's always another layer of the onion to unpeel. But it's not necessarily, for people who have really worked, it's not necessarily repressed stuff. And that's the difference. When stuff is repressed into the unconscious, and you're not aware of it, that's what scares most people, and that's what comes up in dreams. That's what anxieties are about. And a lot of the stuff that comes up that way, it's, when I say it's repressed stuff, it's not necessarily from like a linear time thing, like from childhood. It can even be a past life memory. It can be a motif that has gone through the soul's incarnations. You know what I mean? It's like, it can be part of the collective unconscious, like being tortured in a dream, being raped. It doesn't have to be personal stuff, like you were saying before, with someone experiencing it. It can be from the collective, which it often is. But if it's acknowledged and say, look, that's just one of my things, then you sort of, dredge it up. It just doesn't have all the antenna on it anymore, in terms of being that motivating force. To have a fear of being, let's say, raped, which a lot of women have, they don't have to have gone through it in childhood. And maybe they went through it in another lifetime. Maybe they don't. Maybe it's just because it's a fear of women. It's like a torture fear, raped or something like that. So I call that collective unconscious. No one can drag it all out. It has to come very gradually. Because if they do, like you say, they'll push it back in because it's too much. That's when people freak out, by the way. And I think that's what may have happened to some people years ago using drugs. They saw too much. They got too open. And it was so scary, and that's why they freaked out. They couldn't assimilate all that they saw. So that's why doing this in ritual, gradually, where a little piece comes up and, okay, well, I'm going to work with that one this year, work with that one and integrate it, isn't so scary for people, you see, because it's not overwhelming them. But it can be overwhelming if you push someone through a deep experience which brings up more information than they can integrate psychically at that time. See, and that's very, very scary. And I think that accounts for a lot of freakouts. Just from what I've seen with people. It's just too much. I think that the message of the Dark Goddess to people is transform, change. Don't become crystallized in the state you're in, whether it's your physical state, your emotional state, where you live, what you do. Be willing. Be willing to go down into the underground, into the labyrinth, and shed your skin, and be willing to do it often, And that, to me, that's really her message, And then the other message that she has is, don't be afraid of life. Be wild, be crazy, sing, dance, all those things. Don't be afraid, because the dark goddess is definitely fun. That's the thing. She may take you in the underground, but she is fun. She's wild, sings and dances, and she's not, her message is not to live on the surface. Her message is to live deeply, live with passion, And that may be painful at times, but it's also great, as I said before, the other side, joy. Great joy, be wild, dance, be sensual, be loving, all of those things, be ecstatic. And then you really get to compassion.